Egypt, a land of towering monuments and silent gods, where golden temples shimmered under an unforgiving sun, and colossal statues stood as eternal witnesses to the power of a king who believed himself divine. At the center of it all stood Pharaoh, ruler of the greatest empire on earth, a man whose word carried the weight of life and death. But beneath the grandeur, beneath the illusion of absolute control, something darker was growing, not rebellion, not war, but fear. It crept quietly into the mind of the most powerful man alive, whispering questions he could not ignore. What if the people he ruled were no longer under his control? What if those he enslaved became those who would overthrow him? What if the greatest threat to his empire had already been born? Among the vast population of Egypt lived a people who did not belong, the Hebrews, descendants of those who had once come seeking refuge during a time of famine, welcomed generations ago, but now reduced to chains and labor, forced to build cities they would never live in and monuments that would never bear their names. They toiled under the scorching sun, their backs bent under the weight of stones and oppression. Yet despite the suffering, they multiplied. They grew stronger, more numerous, more resilient than their captors had ever anticipated. And this growth became the seed of Pharaoh's fear. He no longer saw them as workers, not even as slaves, but as a rising force that could one day turn against him. And so his fear demanded action, ruthless and absolute. What happens when the most powerful king in the world becomes afraid of something he cannot control? That fear became a decree, and that decree became a shadow cast over every Hebrew home. Pharaoh commanded that every male child born to the Hebrews must be killed. No hesitation, no mercy, no exceptions. It was not just a law. It was a sentence pronounced over an entire generation before they could even take their first breath. Suddenly, the cry of a newborn was no longer a sign of joy, but a signal of danger. A sound that could bring soldiers crashing through doors and tear families apart in an instant. The land that once offered refuge had become a place of terror, and the future itself seemed to vanish with every child lost. Across the land, whispers replaced laughter, and fear replaced hope. Mothers clutched their infants in silence. Fathers stood helpless against a force they could not fight, and entire families learned to live in the shadows of their own homes. Soldiers moved through the streets with cold precision, enforcing a law that stripped humanity down to nothing but obedience and survival. Every knock on a door sent hearts racing, every distant cry echoed like a warning. And in this world, where life was hunted, survival became an act of defiance. How long can a life remain hidden when an empire is determined to erase it? And then, in the midst of this suffocating darkness, a child was born. Not in celebration, not with songs or blessings, but in silence and trembling fear. A Hebrew woman held her newborn son close, knowing the truth that no mother should ever have to face, that by the law of the land, this child was already condemned. Yet, as she looked into his eyes, something stronger than fear took hold, something that no decree could extinguish: love. It was irrational, dangerous, and unstoppable. She chose to keep him, to hide him, to protect him with everything she had, even if it meant risking everything. Days turned into weeks, and the fragile illusion of safety held. She learned to move without sound, to calm his cries before they could be heard, to exist in a constant state of tension where every second felt like borrowed time. But reality pressed in from all sides. Babies cry, and each cry was a risk that could not be undone. The walls that once felt like protection began to feel like a trap, and the truth became impossible to ignore. She could not hide him forever. The world outside was closing in, and the moment of choice was approaching. If you knew the only way to save your child was to let them go, would you have the strength to do it? In an act that defied both logic and despair, she chose a path that seemed unthinkable. She crafted a basket, weaving it carefully, sealing it with pitch so that it would float, turning a simple object into a vessel of hope. This was not surrender. It was strategy, not abandonment, but an act of faith placed against impossible odds. With trembling hands, she placed her son inside, knowing that once she released him, she would no longer control his fate. The river would decide, or perhaps something beyond the river, something unseen yet undeniable. The Nile flowed as it always had, indifferent to human suffering, carrying life to the land and now carrying something far more fragile. The basket drifted among the reeds, swaying with the current, each movement a silent gamble between survival and disaster. The child lay within, unaware of the danger, unaware that his life hung in the balance between forces far greater than himself. Nearby, hidden among the tall grasses, his sister watched, her eyes fixed on the drifting basket, her heart pounding with every inch it moved. She could do nothing to stop what was happening, but she refused to look away. What happens when destiny carries a child directly into the hands of the very power that sought to destroy him? Further down the river, where the water met the edges of royal privilege, a different scene unfolded. Servants stood ready, their presence quiet yet constant. As a woman of great importance approached the water, she was the daughter of Pharaoh, raised within the very system that had condemned countless children to death. A figure of authority who lived surrounded by luxury and obedience. She came to the river unaware that within moments, her life would intersect with a story far greater than her own. Then she saw it, a basket, alone on the water, out of place and impossible to ignore. Curiosity drew her closer, and with a simple command, she had it brought before her. The servants obeyed without question, retrieving the basket with careful hands, as if sensing that this was no ordinary object. As the lid was lifted, time seemed to slow, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Inside was a child, alive, crying. In that instant, everything changed. This was no mystery to her. She knew exactly what she was looking at, a Hebrew child, one of the very children her father had ordered to be killed. The law was clear, the expectation even clearer. She should have turned away, should have followed the decree, should have allowed the system she was part of to take its course. But there are moments when the human heart refuses to obey the rules written by power, moments when compassion rises above command. Can a single act of mercy defy the will of an empire? The child cried again, a sound that cut through protocol and expectation, a sound that was not political or strategic, but purely human. And in that moment, something shifted within her. She did not see a threat. She did not see a problem to be solved. She saw a life. A fragile, undeniable life that should not have been there, and yet was. And she made a choice, one that carried consequences she could not fully foresee. He would live, but compassion alone would not be enough. A plan was needed, something that could protect the child without drawing suspicion. And as if guided by something beyond chance, the young girl who had been watching stepped forward. Bold, precise, and perfectly timed, she offered a solution, suggesting that a Hebrew woman be found to nurse the child. It was a simple idea, but one that solved everything at once. The princess agreed, and just like that, the impossible became reality. The child was returned to his mother, not as something hidden in fear, but as part of a design that none of them fully understood. When fate returns what was lost, is it coincidence or something greater at work? The mother held her son again, but this time the fear was different. It had not vanished, but it had changed shape, transformed into something quieter, something that carried both relief and inevitability. She knew this was temporary, that the day would come when she would have to let him go again. But now she had time. Time to nurture him, to teach him, to give him a foundation that no palace could erase. The years passed, and the child grew strong. There was something in him, something that could not be defined, a presence that seemed to carry weight even in his earliest days. And when the time came, just as she had known it would, he was taken into the palace, into a world of wealth and power, into a life that stood in complete contrast to where he had begun. He was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, given a new identity, a new place in the world, a future that no one could have predicted when he was set adrift on the river. His name was Moses. What happens when a child born a slave is raised as a prince? He would walk halls of gold, learn the ways of rulers, speak the language of kings, and live among those who commanded the world. But beneath the fine garments, beneath the education and privilege, there was a truth that could not be erased, a truth that waited silently for the moment it would rise to the surface. He was not Egyptian, he was Hebrew, and one day that truth would awaken, and when it did, it would not just change his life, it would change the course of history itself. Egypt, a kingdom where power was measured in gold, obedience, and silence, and within its grand palace, far removed from the suffering of slaves, a child who should have died was growing up as royalty. Moses walked halls lined with towering columns, their surfaces carved with stories of gods and kings. His footsteps echoing through spaces built to remind every visitor exactly who ruled the world. Servants bowed as he passed, teachers spoke to him with reverence, and every door opened before him without question. He wore the finest linen, ate the richest food, and learned the language of command before he even understood the weight of it. To everyone around him, he was Egyptian, a prince shaped by the greatest empire on earth, destined for power, influence, and a future that most could only dream of. But beneath that carefully constructed identity, something deeper remained untouched, something that could not be erased no matter how grand the illusion became. What happens when a man is given everything except the truth about who he really is? From a young age, Moses was trained not just to live in the palace, but to belong there. He studied the wisdom of Egypt, the philosophies of its priests, the strategies of its generals. He learned how to lead armies, how to speak with authority, how to think like a ruler. Every lesson was shaping him into someone who could one day stand beside Pharaoh, or perhaps even become something more. The palace was not just a home, it was a machine, and it was molding him into a piece that fit perfectly within it. And yet, even in a place designed to eliminate doubt, questions have a way of finding their way into the human mind. He would see them sometimes, the workers, bent under heavy loads, their bodies marked by exhaustion, their faces lined with something deeper than fatigue. They moved differently from the Egyptians, spoke in hushed tones, carried a quiet endurance that was both haunting and unbreakable. Moses watched them from a distance at first, curious but disconnected, like someone observing a world that had nothing to do with him. But the more he saw, the harder it became to ignore. There was something familiar in their eyes, something that stirred a feeling he could not explain. Why would a prince feel drawn to the suffering of slaves? The palace could teach him how to rule, but it could not stop him from seeing. And once he began to see, he could not unsee. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Luxury on one side, suffering on the other, power above, oppression below. And somewhere in between stood Moses, belonging fully to neither world. He had the authority of Egypt, but something inside him resisted the indifference that authority required. He began to ask questions, quiet at first, careful, but persistent. Who were these people really? Why were they treated this way? Why did their pain feel personal? The answers did not come all at once. Truth rarely does. It reveals itself slowly, in fragments, in moments that force everything else into question. Perhaps it was something he overheard, a whisper not meant for him. Perhaps it was a look, a hesitation from someone who knew more than they dared to say. Or perhaps it came from the one person who had always been close enough to know the truth, but strong enough to keep it hidden until the time was right. However it happened, the moment came. Moses learned who he truly was. How do you rebuild your identity when everything you believed about yourself was a lie? The revelation did not change the palace around him, but it changed everything within him. The walls were the same, the servants still bowed, the lessons continued, but none of it felt the same anymore. Every privilege he enjoyed now carried a shadow. Every command he could give now had a cost he could no longer ignore. He was not just living among Egyptians. He was living above his own people. The ones he had watched from a distance were no longer strangers. They were his blood, his origin, his truth. And with that truth came a tension that could not be resolved. He could not unknow it. He could not return to the comfort of ignorance, and he could not simply walk away. What happens when you are caught between two worlds, and neither one fully accepts you? Moses began to step outside the palace more often, not as a prince observing his kingdom, but as a man searching for something he could not yet define. He walked among the Hebrews, close enough now to see the details he had once overlooked, the scars, the exhaustion, the quiet resilience that refused to break even under relentless pressure. He heard their voices, their stories, their pain, and the more he listened, the more the distance between him and them began to disappear. But the closer he moved toward them, the further he drifted from the world that had raised him. He saw the Egyptians differently now too, not as teachers, not as protectors, but as enforcers of a system built on suffering. The authority he had been taught to admire now looked like something else entirely, something unjust, something that demanded to be questioned. And once that question took root, it began to grow, pushing against everything he had been taught to accept. Can a man raised in power truly stand against it? Inside Moses, two identities collided: the prince and the Hebrew, the ruler and the outsider, the man shaped by Egypt and the man defined by a past Egypt tried to erase. He tried to carry both, to reconcile them, to find a way to exist without choosing one over the other. But some conflicts cannot be balanced. Some truths demand action. The tension built quietly at first, like pressure beneath the surface, invisible but unstoppable. Every act of injustice he witnessed added to it. Every moment of silence made it worse. He could feel it growing, waiting, pushing him towards something inevitable. And then one day, it broke. How far can a man be pushed before he does something that changes everything? The sun burned high over the land as Moses walked beyond the palace into the places where suffering was no longer hidden. He saw a group of Hebrew slaves at work, their bodies strained under impossible demands, and among them stood an Egyptian overseer, his authority expressed through violence. The crack of a strike echoed through the air, sharp and brutal, followed by the sound of pain that no one dared to respond to. Moses stopped. This was not new. He had seen it before. But this time, something was different. This time, he could not walk away. The moment stretched, suspended between choice and consequence. He looked around. No one seemed to be watching. The overseer raised his hand again, ready to strike, to reinforce a system that thrived on fear. And in that instant, everything inside Moses converged: his anger, his identity, his sense of justice, his refusal to remain silent. He stepped forward. What happens when a man who has always been protected chooses to step into danger? The confrontation was swift, raw, unplanned. Words may have been exchanged, or perhaps none were needed. The line had already been crossed the moment Moses decided to act. The struggle ended as quickly as it began, but its outcome could not be undone. The Egyptian lay dead. Silence followed. Heavy, unforgiving. Moses stood there, the reality of what he had done settling over him like a shadow that could not be escaped. This was no longer a question of identity, no longer a matter of internal conflict. This was action, irreversible, dangerous. Real. He looked around again, panic beginning to replace certainty. If anyone saw, if anyone knew, everything would change. He moved quickly, hiding the body in the sand, trying to bury not just the evidence, but the moment itself. But some actions cannot be buried. They rise, they spread, they find their way into the light. Can you hide the truth when it was never meant to stay hidden? The next day, Moses returned, perhaps hoping the world had not shifted as much as he feared, perhaps trying to convince himself that what had happened was contained, controlled. But the illusion shattered almost immediately. He saw the Hebrew men fighting, and instinctively, he stepped in, trying to stop them, trying to bring peace where there was conflict. But this time, he was not seen as a prince. He was not even seen as one of them. He was something else entirely. "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" one of them said, the words cutting deeper than any blade. "Are you going to kill me too, like you killed the Egyptian?" In that moment, everything collapsed. The secret was out. The act he thought he had hidden was already known, and the world he stood in was no longer safe. What happens when both sides reject you at the same time? Fear took hold, sharp and immediate. This was no longer just a personal crisis. It was a matter of survival. If the Hebrews knew, then the Egyptians would know soon enough. And if Pharaoh found out, there would be no mercy. The palace that once protected him had become the most dangerous place he could be. The identity he had struggled to understand had now placed him in direct opposition to the most powerful man on earth. And for the first time in his life, Moses had to run. Not as a prince, not as a leader, but as a fugitive. Because the moment he chose to stand for something, he lost everything he once had. The desert does not welcome you. It strips you. The moment Moses fled Egypt, the world he had known vanished behind him like a mirage dissolving in heat. And ahead of him stretched nothing but endless sand, unforgiving sky, and silence, so deep it felt like it could swallow a man whole. There were no palace walls here, no servants, no protection, no identity to shield him from reality. Only distance, and the consequences of a single moment that changed everything. He had acted, he had crossed the line, and now the price of that action was exile. Every step he took away from Egypt was a step deeper into the unknown, and for the first time in his life, Moses was completely alone. What happens when the man raised to command no longer has anything left to stand on? The sun burned relentlessly, pressing down on him as if the heavens themselves were testing his resolve. Each breath tasted like dust, each step heavier than the last. This was not the life of a prince. This was survival, raw and unfiltered. The ground offered no comfort, the horizon no promise. And somewhere behind him, far beyond what he could see, was Pharaoh, a king who would not forget, a ruler whose authority had been challenged in the most personal way. Moses was not just a fugitive, he was a threat that had to be erased. There would be no negotiation, no forgiveness. If he were found, his story would end in the same land where it had begun. But the desert does something strange to a man. It does not just weaken the body, it forces the mind to confront what it has been avoiding. With every mile, Moses could no longer escape his own thoughts. The image of that moment returned again and again. The strike, the fall, the stillness that followed. He had wanted justice. He had acted out of conviction. But now, he was left with questions that had no easy answers. Had he done the right thing, or had he only proven that violence creates more violence? Was he a deliverer, or just another man who let anger decide his actions? Can a single act define who you are forever? Days blurred into each other. The rhythm of survival replacing the structure of palace life. Hunger became familiar, thirst became constant, and exhaustion settled into his bones. The desert did not care who he had been. It did not recognize titles or past achievements. It reduced everything down to one simple truth. Either you endure, or you disappear. And in that harsh simplicity, something within Moses began to change. The man who had once walked through marble halls without a second thought was now learning what it meant to depend on nothing but his own strength and the fragile hope that he would find somewhere, anywhere, to belong. Then, in the distance, something broke the endless monotony. A well. Water meant life. It meant people, community, a break from isolation. As Moses approached, he saw figures gathered there, shepherds and flocks, movement that signaled something more than survival. But even in this place of life, conflict was not far behind. A group of shepherds pushed forward aggressively, driving others away, asserting dominance in a scene that mirrored the injustice Moses had fled. Only now, there was no palace, no hierarchy, just raw human behavior repeating itself in a different form. What do you do when injustice follows you, even into exile? Among those being pushed aside were a group of women, their flocks scattered, their efforts undone by force. They stood their ground, but they were outnumbered, their resistance quiet against the louder presence of those who would take what they wanted simply because they could. Moses watched, and in that moment, something inside him stirred again. The same instinct, the same refusal to stand by while power crushed the vulnerable. But this time, everything was different. There was no identity to defend, no hidden truth driving him, no personal connection to the victims. Only a choice. He stepped forward, not as a prince, not as a Hebrew, just as a man who could not ignore what was happening. Is it possible to change? Or do we simply repeat who we've always been? The confrontation unfolded quickly, tension cutting through the air as Moses placed himself between the aggressors and those they sought to overpower. Words may have been exchanged, or perhaps it was something deeper, a presence, a resolve that made it clear he would not move. Whatever it was, the outcome shifted. The shepherds backed down, unwilling to escalate further against someone who showed no sign of fear. The women were able to return, to draw water, to reclaim what had been taken from them. It was a small moment. No audience, no recognition, no consequence beyond the act itself. And yet, it was everything. Because this time, Moses did not act out of anger. He acted out of conviction. And that difference would shape everything that followed. When no one is watching, who do you choose to be? The women, surprised and grateful, finished their work and returned home earlier than expected. Their father noticed immediately. This was not the usual pattern, not the usual struggle. When they told him what had happened, about the stranger who had stepped in, who had helped without hesitation, without asking for anything in return, he made a decision. Invite him, he said. Bring him here. Because in a world where strength often meant domination, a man who used it to protect was worth knowing. Moses, still carrying the weight of his past, found himself entering a place that felt entirely foreign, not because it was grand, but because it was simple. A home, a family, a space where survival was shared, not fought over. The man who welcomed him was not a king, not a ruler, but he carried a different kind of authority, one rooted in wisdom, in experience, in something that did not need to prove itself through force. And for the first time since leaving Egypt, Moses was offered something he did not expect. Rest. What happens when a man who has lost everything is given a chance to begin again? Time passed, not in the rigid structure of palace life, but in the natural rhythm of days and seasons. Moses stayed. He worked. He learned. The desert that had once felt like a place of punishment began to feel like a place of transformation. He was no longer running, no longer defined solely by what he had done. He was becoming something new, something quieter, something grounded. He became a shepherd. A man who once commanded attention now guided flocks through open land. A man who once lived surrounded by noise now spent hours in silence, listening not to orders, but to the wind, the land, the subtle shifts of a world far removed from power and politics. It was a life stripped of complexity, but within that simplicity, something deeper was forming. Years passed, not days, not months, years. The past did not disappear, but it changed shape. The urgency faded, the sharp edges softened, and in their place grew patience, humility, and a strength that did not rely on position or status. Moses built a life, formed relationships, found a sense of belonging that had once seemed impossible. He married. He became part of a family. He had something to lose again. Can a man truly leave his past behind? Or is it only waiting for the right moment to return? Out in the wilderness, guiding his flock through terrain that had become familiar, Moses lived a life that no one in Egypt would recognize. The prince was gone. The fugitive had settled. The man who once stood at the center of power now existed at the edges of the world, far from the reach of kings and the weight of expectation. It would have been easy to believe that this was the end of his story, that the moment in Egypt had been the peak, the turning point that led only to a quiet, forgotten life. But some stories are not shaped by what we expect. Some lives are not meant to fade into the background, because just when everything seems settled, when the past feels distant, when the future appears predictable, something happens, something that changes everything. What if exile was never the end, but preparation for something far greater? Moses did not know it yet. As he moved through the wilderness, as he led his flock toward the far side of the desert, as the sun dipped and the shadows stretched long across the land, he was walking toward a moment that would redefine not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. A moment that would not come from kings or armies, or power as the world understood it, but from something far more unexpected, something that would call his name and demand an answer. The wilderness had become predictable, and that was the most dangerous thing about it. For years, Moses walked the same paths, guided the same flocks, watched the same horizon stretch endlessly before him. The desert that once felt like punishment had turned into routine, and routine has a way of convincing a man that this is all there is. The past fades, the questions quiet down, and the future becomes something small, manageable, safe. Moses was no longer the prince of Egypt, no longer the fugitive running for his life. He was a shepherd, a husband, a man who had built a quiet existence far away from the chaos he once knew. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something unresolved still lingered, something waiting for the right moment to rise again. What if the life you've settled into was never meant to be your final destination? One day, like any other, Moses led his flock deeper into the wilderness, farther than usual, toward a place few would go willingly. The land grew more desolate, the air more still, as if even nature itself was holding back. This was the far side of the desert, a place where silence felt heavier, where every sound carried farther, where the boundary between the ordinary and the unknown seemed thinner. And it was there, in that quiet, in that isolation, that something impossible appeared. A bush burning, but not consumed at first. It might have seemed like a trick of the light, a flicker in the distance distorted by heat. But as Moses drew closer, the reality became undeniable. The flames were real. The fire moved, alive, intense, and yet the bush remained untouched, not turning to ash, not collapsing into embers. It burned, and burned, and burned. But it did not die. What do you do when you see something that cannot be explained? Curiosity pulled him closer, not the casual curiosity of a passing glance, but something deeper, something that demanded attention. This was not normal, not natural, not something he could ignore and walk away from. Every step he took toward it felt like crossing a line, moving from the familiar into something entirely different. The world around him seemed to fade. The desert, the flock, the routine, all of it falling into the background as the fire became the only thing that mattered. And then a voice. Moses, not loud, not distant, but clear, direct, personal. It did not echo across the desert. It did not come from above or below. It came from the fire, and it spoke his name as if it had always known him. What happens when the impossible calls you by name? Moses froze. This was no illusion, no trick of the mind. The voice came again, steady, undeniable. There was no doubt now. This was something beyond anything he had ever encountered, something that did not fit within the limits of the world he understood. Instinctively, he responded, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with the only words that made sense in that moment. Here I am. It was not a declaration of readiness. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that something greater had just entered his life, and nothing would ever be the same again. Do not come any closer, the voice said. The command was immediate, authoritative, not harsh, but absolute. Moses stopped, every instinct telling him that he was standing on the edge of something sacred, something powerful, something that demanded respect beyond anything he had ever known. Take off your sandals, the voice continued, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Holy, the word itself carried weight. But here, in the middle of a desert that had felt empty and ordinary for so long, it transformed everything. This was no longer just land, no longer just a place of exile or routine. This was a meeting point between the human and the divine, between the finite and the infinite. Moses removed his sandals, his hands moving almost without thought, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. Who speaks from fire and calls the ground itself holy? Then the voice revealed more. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. These were not unfamiliar names. They were the foundation of a history Moses had only begun to understand, the roots of the identity he had discovered years ago, but never fully explored. And now, in this moment, that history was no longer distant. It was present, alive, speaking directly to him. Overwhelmed, Moses hid his face, not out of fear alone, but out of recognition, the realization that he was standing in the presence of something infinitely greater than himself. The desert, the years of exile, the life he had built, all of it suddenly felt small in comparison to what was unfolding before him. Can a man who has spent years running from his past suddenly be called to face it? I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt, the voice said, not heard about it, not been told, not seen it. Every act of oppression, every cry, every moment of pain, none of it had been ignored. I have heard their cries. The silence that had once seemed so absolute was no longer empty. It had been listening all along. I know their suffering, not from a distance, not as an observer, but as something deeply understood. And then the words that would change everything. I have come down to deliver them. Deliverance. Freedom. The very thing Moses had once acted on in a single, impulsive moment, now spoken as a divine mission. But the next words, they were the ones that shattered any sense of distance between him and this calling. So now, go back. To Egypt, to the place he had fled, to the king he had escaped, to the life he had left behind. What happens when the place you ran from is exactly where you are sent back to? Moses recoiled internally. Everything in him resisted. This was not what he expected, not what he wanted, not what he believed he was capable of. He had built a new life, found peace, left that world behind, and now he was being asked to walk straight back into it, not as a fugitive, but as a messenger. Who am I? Moses asked, his voice carrying the weight of years of doubt. That I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt. It was a real question, not false humility, not hesitation for the sake of hesitation. He knew who Pharaoh was. He knew what Egypt represented, and he knew who he had become, or perhaps who he believed he had become. A shepherd. An exile. A man who had failed once already. Why would he be the one chosen for something this impossible? How can a man believe in a calling when he no longer believes in himself? The answer did not come in the form of reassurance about his abilities or a reminder of his past status. It came in something far more profound. I will be with you. Not you are strong enough. Not you are capable. But you will not be alone. And sometimes, that is the only answer that matters. Still, Moses struggled. Questions rose one after another. Doubts layered over fears. Every reason why this could not work. Why he was not the right person. Why someone else should be chosen instead. He asked what he should say, how he should explain this to the people, how they would believe him. And the response. It was not a name in the way humans understand names. It was something deeper. I am who I am. A declaration of existence itself. Unchanging. Unquestionable. Beyond definition. This was not just a mission. This was authority beyond any king. What do you do when the voice calling you cannot be ignored? The desert was no longer quiet. The fire was no longer just a mystery. This was a turning point. A moment that divided Moses' life into before and after. Before the fire, before the calling, before the command, and now, after. He could not return to who he had been. He could not pretend this had not happened. The life of a shepherd, the safety of distance, the comfort of anonymity, all of it had been interrupted by something that demanded response. And whether he felt ready or not, whether he believed in himself or not, whether he wanted this or not, he had been chosen. Because sometimes the greatest missions are not given to those who seek them, but to those who try to avoid them. And in that moment, standing barefoot on holy ground, face hidden from a fire that burned without, consuming, Moses realized something that would define everything that followed. His story was not over. It had only just begun. Egypt had not changed, but everything about Moses had. The same land he once fled now stood before him again, vast, powerful, unshaken, as if the years between had meant nothing. The Nile still flowed, the temples still towered, and Pharaoh still ruled with absolute authority. But this time, Moses was not returning as a prince, and not as a fugitive running for his life. He was returning with a message, a command, something that did not come from kings or armies, but from a voice that could not be ignored. And yet, as he stood on the edge of the land that had once defined him, the weight of what he had been asked to do pressed heavily on him. Because going back was one thing, but confronting Pharaoh, that was something else entirely. What do you say to the most powerful man on earth when you've been sent to challenge everything he stands for? Moses was not alone. By his side was Aaron, his brother, a voice to support him, a presence to stand with him in moments where doubt would try to take control. Together, they stepped into a world that had once rejected Moses, walking toward the very heart of power, toward a throne that did not tolerate opposition. The palace doors that once opened for him without question now stood as barriers, symbols of a system he was about to confront head-on. Inside, nothing had softened. Pharaoh remained as unyielding as ever, a ruler who saw himself not just as king, but as a living god. His authority was absolute, his word final, and the idea that anyone would come before him with a demand was unthinkable. Yet that is exactly what Moses did. He stood before Pharaoh, not as a servant, not as a subject, but as a messenger, and with a steady voice, carrying a command far greater than his own, he spoke the words that would echo through history. Let my people go. How does a king respond when someone dares to tell him he is not in control? Pharaoh's reaction was immediate and predictable. Not fear, not hesitation, but rejection. Who was this god? He demanded that he should obey him. Egypt had its own gods, its own power, its own order. Pharaoh did not recognize any authority above his own. And to him, Moses was not a threat. He was an annoyance, a disruption to a system that had worked exactly as intended. So he did not just refuse. He tightened his grip. The Hebrews would not be freed. Their burden would be increased, their suffering multiplied. What happens when standing up for freedom makes things worse instead of better? The command went out across the land. The slaves would continue their labor, but now without the resources they once had. Straw would no longer be provided for making bricks, yet the same quota remained. The work became harder, the conditions harsher, the punishment more severe. The people Moses had come to help now suffered even more because of his actions, and they knew it. They felt it. They turned on him. "May the Lord judge you," they said, their frustration cutting deep. "You have made us a stench to Pharaoh." In that moment, the weight of the mission became almost unbearable. Moses had obeyed. He had done what he was told. And the result was pain, rejection, and failure. Was this really the plan? Was this what he had been called to do? When doing the right thing leads to suffering, do you keep going or turn back? Moses returned, not to Pharaoh, but to the one who had sent him. His words were not polished, not composed, but raw and honest. "Why have you brought trouble on this people?" he asked. "Why did you send me?" It was not rebellion. It was confusion. It was the cry of a man caught between obedience and outcome, trying to understand why a mission that was meant to bring freedom had only brought more pain. And the answer was not immediate relief. It was something else. A promise. A declaration that what was happening now was not the end of the story. "I am the Lord," the voice said, "and I will bring them out. Not might, not could. Will. Because what was about to unfold would not be done through negotiation. It would be done through power. What happens when a king refuses to listen, and something greater decides to make him? The next time Moses stood before Pharaoh, the message had not changed. "Let my people go." But this time, the confrontation was different. This time, it was not just words. It was a demonstration, a sign that this was not a human demand, but a divine one. Aaron's staff was thrown to the ground, and before the eyes of Pharaoh and his court, it became a serpent, a moment that should have shaken the room. But Pharaoh was not easily moved. His magicians stepped forward, replicating the sign, turning their own staffs into serpents as well. For a moment, it seemed like a draw. Power against power. Sign against sign. But then, something subtle, yet undeniable happened. Moses' serpent consumed theirs, a quiet statement, a warning, a glimpse of what was to come. Can a hardened heart ignore what it sees with its own eyes? Pharaoh did. His heart remained unchanged. His decision stood firm. And with that, the stage was set for something far beyond a single sign or a single moment. What followed would not be subtle. It would not be quiet. It would not be something that could be ignored or explained away. It would come in waves. One after another, each one stronger, each one clearer, each one forcing a choice. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, turned to blood. The water that sustained the land became undrinkable. A symbol of life transformed into a source of death. Fish died. The river stank. And what had once been taken for granted became a crisis that could not be ignored. But Pharaoh resisted. Frogs covered the land, filling homes, invading spaces where they did not belong, turning comfort into chaos. They were everywhere, impossible to escape. A relentless reminder that something was happening beyond human control. Still, Pharaoh resisted. Gnats rose from the dust, swarming over man and beast, followed by flies that darkened the air, turning the land into a place of constant irritation and discomfort. Livestock fell, disease spread, boils broke out on skin, pain becoming personal, unavoidable. And yet, Pharaoh resisted. How many warnings does it take before a man admits he is not in control? Each plague was not just destruction. It was a message, a dismantling of Egypt's confidence, a challenge to its gods, a demonstration that the power Pharaoh believed in was not absolute. Hail fell from the sky, destroying crops, fire mingling with ice in a display that defied nature itself. Locusts followed, consuming what little remained, leaving the land stripped bare. And then, darkness, not the absence of light, but something heavier, a darkness that could be felt. That covered the land for days, a silence that pressed in on every side. A pause before something greater. Even then, Pharaoh's heart did not fully break. What does it take to bring a kingdom to its knees? Moses stood once more before Pharaoh, the tension at its peak, the air thick with everything that had already happened and everything that was about to come. This was no longer just a confrontation between two men. It was a collision between two authorities, two wills, two realities. And the next step would be the one that could not be undone, because the final sign would not touch the land. It would touch something far deeper, something no ruler could ignore. Something that would force a decision, once and for all. And as Moses turned to leave, carrying the weight of what was about to happen, one truth became clear. The story was no longer about whether Pharaoh would listen. It was about what would happen when he didn't. The night Egypt broke did not begin with noise, but with silence. A silence so heavy it felt like the entire land was holding its breath, as if something unseen was moving through every street, every home, every life. Moses had warned Pharaoh again and again. The signs had come. The plagues had shaken the kingdom. The power of Egypt had been challenged in ways no one thought possible. But Pharaoh had refused to listen. And now, the final moment had arrived. Not a warning, not a sign, but a turning point that would force a decision no king could escape. What happens when a ruler defies every warning and the consequences finally arrive? Across Egypt, families slept uneasily, unaware that history was about to split into before and after. But among the Hebrews, it was different. They had been given instructions, precise and urgent. Stay inside. Mark your doors. Be ready to leave. This was not just preparation. It was anticipation. Something was about to happen. Something that would not only change their circumstances, but redefine who they were as a people. And then it came. In the deepest part of the night, a cry rose from Egypt. Not one voice, not one home. But many. A sound of grief, of shock, of loss so sudden and so widespread that it echoed across the entire land. From the palace of Pharaoh to the smallest dwelling, the firstborn of Egypt had fallen. The final blow had struck, not against the land, not against the crops or animals, but against the very heart of every household. This was the moment everything changed. How does a king respond when even his own house is not spared? Pharaoh broke. The man who had resisted, who had hardened his heart through every warning, every sign, every act of power, finally gave the command, "Go. Not tomorrow. Not later. Now. Leave." Egypt, take your people, and go. After generations of slavery, after years of suffering, after moments when hope seemed impossible, freedom came suddenly, almost violently, like a door thrown open after being sealed shut. For too long, the Hebrews gathered what they could, moving quickly, urgently, knowing that this moment could not be delayed. This was not a slow transition. This was an escape. They left Egypt in the dark, carrying their children, their belongings, their future, stepping into a world they had never known. What does freedom feel like? When it comes faster than you're ready for. The journey began with urgency, but as distance grew between them and Egypt, something else began to rise. Relief, disbelief, the realization that they were no longer slaves. The chains were gone, the commands silenced. For the first time in generations, they were moving not because they were forced, but because they were free. But freedom, especially sudden freedom, comes with uncertainty. They did not know where they were going. They did not know what lay ahead. They only knew they could not go back, or so they thought. Because back in Egypt, something changed. What happens when a king who finally lets go, suddenly, regrets it? Pharaoh's grief turned into anger. The loss, the devastation, the shock of what had happened, twisted into something else. A realization that the people who had built his cities, who had sustained his empire, were now gone. And with that realization came a decision. He would not let them go. He gathered his army, chariots ready, soldiers prepared, the full force of Egypt's power mobilized for one purpose: to bring them back, not as free people, but as slaves. Once again, can freedom truly begin if the past is still chasing you? The Hebrews did not see it at first. They continued their journey, moving through the wilderness, guided forward by something they did not fully understand. But then, on the horizon, a new sight appeared. Dust rising, movement, an army, Egypt was coming. Panic spread quickly, faster than any command could contain. The same people who had just walked out of slavery now faced the possibility of being dragged back into it. The same freedom that had felt so real now felt fragile, threatened, temporary. They turned on Moses. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die? They cried, fear overtaking faith, survival instinct overriding everything else. In that moment, they saw no miracle, no plan, no future. Only danger, only death. What do you do when the path forward is blocked and the past is closing in? Because in front of them was the sea. Endless. Uncross able. And behind them was Egypt, closing the distance. There was no escape. No strategy. No way out. Only a choice: panic or trust. Moses stood before the people, the weight of everything pressing down on him once again. This was not the palace. This was not a conversation. This was a moment where everything would either collapse or be transformed. Do not be afraid, he said, not because there was no danger, but because fear would not save them. Stand firm, and you will see deliverance. Not something they could create, something they would witness. How do you stand still when everything in you is screaming to run? Then the command came, not to the people, but to Moses. Raise your staff, a simple action. But in that moment, it carried everything. Moses stepped forward, standing at the edge of the sea. The sound of the approaching army growing louder, the fear of the people rising behind him. This was the point of no return. He lifted his staff, and the impossible happened. The waters began to move. At first, a shift, then a force. The sea did not just open, it split. Water rose on both sides, forming walls where there had been none, creating a path through what had once been an absolute barrier. The ground beneath became dry, solid, walkable, a way forward where there had been none. What happens when the obstacle you feared the most becomes the path you must walk? The people hesitated. How could they not? This was beyond anything they had ever seen. But behind them Egypt was still coming. So they stepped forward. One by one. Then more. Then all. Walking between walls of water, moving through a path that should not exist, surrounded by something that could collapse at any moment, and yet did not. They crossed, every man, every woman, every child, from fear into freedom. But the story was not over, because Pharaoh's army followed. What happens when power chases you into a miracle it does not understand? The chariots entered the path, confident, relentless, believing that what had opened for the Hebrews would remain open for them. But this was never about the path alone. It was about who it was for. As the last of the Hebrews reached the other side, the moment came. The command again. The staff raised once more, and the waters returned. Not slowly, not gently, but completely. The walls collapsed, the path disappeared, and the sea reclaimed what had been forced apart. Egypt's army was gone. In a single moment, the greatest military power of its time was undone. Not by weapons, not by strategy, but by something far beyond both. When the impossible happens, what is left to fear? Silence returned. But this time, it was different. Not heavy, not filled with dread, but full. Complete. The people stood on the other side, looking back at what had just happened, trying to understand, to process, to believe what their eyes had seen. They were free, not temporarily, not conditionally. But completely. The past was gone. The chains were broken. The pursuit had ended. And in that moment, something new was born. Not just a group of former slaves, but a people, a nation, defined not by what had been done to them, but by what they had been brought through. And Moses, the child who had once been placed in a river to escape death, now stood before a sea that had opened at his command. From a basket to a nation. From silence to deliverance. From fear to faith. Because sometimes the greatest miracles are not just about escape, but about transformation. And this was only the beginning.